The only thing more classic than a 1967 short wheelbase Porsche 911S is the Audrain Museum Network. Are you a subscriber? You're not? You better join right now. Hello and welcome to the Audrain Automobile Museum and our exhibition Air-Cooled. Keep it simple. In this video, we're going to talk about a slight variation on the theme. We've hinted for quite a while about air cooling not being quite what you think it is in some applications. And to help me explain what might not be visible on the surface is someone who has many, many, many layers. Mr. Nick Waller, the president of the Audrain Automobile Museum. Nick?
I have many layers, especially in the winter.
Indeed, exactly. And in fact. The car that we're standing in front of is a 1961 Corvair Lakewood station wagon. And of course, as you know, as the Audrain Museum Network family knows, Corvairs are near and dear to my heart, my first car having been a 1963 Corvair Monza.
And I can totally acclimatize myself with your thoughts, because I don't think that's a phrase, but I have fallen in love with this car. I love the looks, I love the colors, I love the low profile. It's one of the lowest station wagons I've ever seen. It's a really, really interesting form of transport, especially in a station wagon.
It's a really neat car, and for those of you who want to see this car on the road, and I know everyone does, be sure to look at the video of Audrain Mansions and Motorcars, in which Jay and I drive this car when we visit the house Soleil. And it's a really neat car, and it's been modified tastefully, very tastefully modified.
Yep.
So it's a slightly, I wouldn't even call it a resto mod, it's just a slightly customized Corvair wagon. Some very tasteful things. For instance, it's got an all-leather interior as opposed to the vinyl interior with which it came. Some electronic gauges instead, and an uprated engine. But let's talk about the engine, because that's why we're here, to talk about engines.
Absolutely. So explain to me where they went from the original thought of purely air-cooled, how they then transposed into oil and air and water.
Well, as you've heard in some of the previous videos, the transition from pure air cooling to another method of assisted cooling comes with power.
Right.
And one of the things that makes these Corvairs so remarkable, especially for their period, is the fact that these flat six engines came in states of tune from 80, 102, 110, 140, up to 150 horsepower.
Yeah.
So once you add in the component of higher compression and higher power, you get more heat.
Yeah.
And so in the rear, especially in a rear engine mounted situation, you don't have the benefit of air flowing through a front grille,
right,
unless you're going to have a lot of very expensive, very complicated ducting. You have to use the body louvers as well as the airflow underneath the car to cool the engine. So therefore, you've got a very, much like you see on Porsches, the engine is enclosed in an aluminum shroud, which helps to also dissipate the heat from the cylinders. And then you have to also use the oil, which every engine has oil in it.
Yeah.
And so the oil acts as a secondary heat source. So there's a small oil cooler that's fitted in order to keep the oil at a cool level to help keep the cylinders even cooler.
Understood. So we are in air and oil territory.
Air and oil. And as anyone who owned a Corvair knows, if your Corvair is out of oil, you are not driving it. And it's something which we would see later on a lot of Porsches. Again, right, as Porsches grew in power from the 356 through the 911 variants, and you'd see that oil played a stronger and stronger role in the cooling of the engine.
Yeah. Well, I can understand that. I mean, the engine is very low down.
Yes.
It's almost on the ground almost. I mean, it's there. Very much enclosed. Nowhere for the heat to go. So it's a really interesting solution to the problem. Now, explain again, because these cars I don't think ever sold in the Europe or the UK. Very rarely.
I think they were sold in Europe, but not in the UK.
No,
right,
not in the UK. So I never really came across them until I moved here. But they had a reputation, and slightly unfairly, I think.
It was a very unfair reputation. Of course, most people know Corvairs as the car featured in Ralph Nader's book, Unsafe at Any Speed. And by the way, the Corvair was not the car he spoke about most. He spoke most about a VW Beetle, actually, but that's another story. The VW Beetle didn't have the kind of power that the Corvair has. So you can't get into the same kind of trouble with a VW Beetle that you could with a Corvair, but you can get into much more trouble with, or as much trouble, I should say, with a Porsche of the same period.
Yeah.
And it all had to do with swing axles and the rear engine, and also something which, much like the Ford Explorer situation decades later, Corvairs had to be run with very specific tire pressures. Because there was no weight in the front of the car, effectively. You ran very, very low tire pressure in the front and very high in the rear.
Yeah.
And that helped the car stay on the ground. And in high-speed cornering, you would get that very quick snap understeer.
Right.
And so that was fixed, actually, after 1964, because the car was fitted with a transverse compensating spring. Now, some say, and it's probably true, that the original designers, who were incredibly clever folks at Chevrolet, designed the car with a compensating spring, and it was allegedly cut by the cost accountants that said, why do you need this? Who's going to drive the car fast enough that you would need this?
Never let an accountant get in the way of motor car manufacturing, because that's the death knell. That's the end. You may as well give up.
Absolutely, but it also probably has something to do with the original intent of the Corvair and what it became.
Yeah.
It was intended as a basic transport bug fighter, so it's going to be a sort of putter around town kind of a car, but the engineers quickly were able to get General Motors to sign on for the convertible model and the coupe model, and then this wagon, then they did pickup trucks and panel vans,
everything,
all on this platform. And it's also something that, with the levels of performance, I come back to the fact that the oil cooling was necessary because of the levels of performance. You realize that, for instance, in the collection is the wonderful 1962 Corvair Monza Spider Club Coupe, the turbocharged version that came from the Begovic collection.
Beautiful car.
And when you compare the 1962 spec of that car versus a Porsche 356B, the hottest version, the Super 90 with 90 horsepower, that car had 140 horsepower. That was only bested by the 150 horsepower in the Porsche Carrera 2, which cost twice as much as the Corvair.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
but they were pioneering, or they continuing the rear engine theme, and that was thought to be, to catch the imagination, and it certainly did. But I just find this car absolutely captivating, and it was the most expensive variant of the Corvair line, I think.
The station wagon, with the exception, of course, of the turbocharged cars, the station wagon was the most expensive, and it also, I never tire of telling people this, it comes from a time when General Motors was a really forward-looking, very progressive, very risk-taking company at this time, with the rear-engine Corvair, independent rear suspension in the Corvette, turbocharging, rear transaxle in the Tempest. I mean, they were doing all these all these things that you only associate with European manufacturers.
It was really the last hurrah for trying everything.
Exactly.
Then things started to get more
So Lee
standardized.
Iacocca and the Ford Mustang ruined the entire party for everybody. I love Mustangs, make no mistake about it. But nonetheless, it's also very interesting. We're thinking about the concept of air cooling. It was most difficult to actually achieve, of course, in this model, the station wagon, because in the sedans and the coupes and the convertibles, there were louvers on the rear deck, which helped for cooling. Here there are louvers on the rear lid of the hatchback, but everything is below the cargo area.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant design, and also the styling is something that influenced a lot of European manufacturers. Take a look at the NSU TT, very much like this. A number of other Italian cars as well.
The Hillman, I can think of many. The Ford Cortina, which sold in millions. It absolutely was, you can see the designers going around the motor show going, well, we'll have some of that, we'll have some of that. And I love that.
You think 1959 America showing a car like this. Absolutely amazing.
But it is very European in scale. Let's not forget, it's not a huge station wagon like a lot of them were. This actually suits the roads of Europe and would have suited the roads of the UK had they sold it. And it would be a very interesting car to own there.
All we need is a time machine, and you and I could do that.
Go back.
Well, speaking of time machines, we're going to take a look at a very different rear-engined, air-cooled car from Europe. So thank you very much, Nick.
Good to see you.
See you later. So we've taken a look at the Corvair, a very advanced American rear-engine car, and now we're going to take a look at a truly pioneering rear-engined air-cooled vehicle, this Tatra. And to do that, who better than our resident Czech car expert and enthusiast, Mr. Sam Nussbaum. Sam.
Happy to be here.
Great to be here with you and this Tatra. Now, I know that you are absolutely captivated by these cars, frankly, as am I as well. And our friend Jay Leno, of course, is equally captivated. And I'll just tell one very close, warm, personal story, if I may. One day I was going out to Burbank to do a shoot with Jay, and I need to get picked up at the airport. And so Jay said, "Oh, I'll come by and pick you up." I thought, okay, well, that's nice. But he came by in his Tatra to pick me up, to take me to the hotel. And I thought, you know, all Uber drivers should have Tatras.
I agree.
These cars are extraordinary. And why are they extraordinary, Sam?
These are not just normal cars that anyone could buy. In fact, you couldn't really buy one. They were pretty much only given to party leaders in the Soviet Union or the KGB. So if you saw one of these driving around on the road, you got out of the way. They were air-cooled V8s in the rear, and they stuck with that for way longer than anyone would picture it. In fact, they're still making them today. They started with the air-cooled V8 back in the Tatra 77, which Jay has, and they've continued it until, in the passenger car, until 1996 with the Tatra 700.
Well, what's truly extraordinary about Tatra and these rear-engine cars is, as I mentioned before, pioneers. You mentioned pre-war. So they were doing these cars before World War II. And also the idea of the rear-engine air-cooled format, the aerodynamic format, all these came from the incredible mind of Hans Ledwinka, the chief designer for Tatra. And frankly, it's not overstating the case that we would not have the Volkswagen Beetle or the Porsche 356, 911, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, if it had not been for Tatra.
Not at all. The Tatra V570 came along a few years before the Volkswagen Beetle, designed by Hans Ledwinka, among others. And once the Beetle was being production, the KDF wagon, Tatra filed a lawsuit against Porsche, and they were about to pay out until a mustached man from Germany came along and did away with that lawsuit.
I can't imagine why. Well, that's another story which, of course, you cannot talk about Tatras, and I know that, again, I just have to do this for Jay, because every time Jay Leno mentions Tatra, he's got to tell the story about the German high command forbidding their generals from driving or being driven in the Tatra sedans because they were too dangerous on the roads. Now, again, like the Corvair, which we just talked about, and unsafe at any speed, those pre-war Tatras were not particularly unsafe vehicles. If you were not familiar with how to drive one, yes, you could get into trouble with one. But certainly by the time we get to these post-war models, that's really not an issue.
No. In fact, they did a lot of racing with 603s just like this. They were about to enter in the 1960 Monaco rally when the leaders of the Czechoslovakian government said, I don't really want you guys to compete. Same with Skoda. But Skoda was able to compete because they actually sold their cars in the West, where Tatra did not. So sadly, we never got to see one of these race.
These would have been absolutely incredible, racing against the Mercedes sedans, and it would have been an amazing sight to see indeed. Now, of course, we're talking in this segment about the combination of air and additional cooling. Now, these V8s, these spectacular V8s, also feature a measure of oil cooling because you have to cool the cylinder heads of a rear-mounted V8. These are aluminum V8s, correct?
I believe so.
Yes. So you have to do some cooling in order to actually make these work efficiently. So these cars have a relatively small, for modern times, oil cooler, and part of the engine sits in the airflow below the car?
Yes. Right below the engine to the side, there's this radiator box that, I mean, it looks like a radiator, but it's actually an oil cooler. And that helped a lot with the cooling. With the competition version of this car, called the B5, they only made one or two of those. It actually used a Venturi system to pull air over the engine. And they found that it worked so well, they were able to do away with the fans, which, you know, for a rear engine V8, a competition engine with no fans is unheard of.
One of the things that I also love about this concept is a car that no one knows anything about. It's not an air-cooled car, but it is another car with a rear-mounted V8, in this case magnesium, the last of the Azotafreschinis, the Monterosas. And in designing a car like this, there's also the challenge of providing enough airflow. And this car actually manages to integrate some fairly hefty air intakes on the side fenders that don't look obtrusive.
Not at all. They go with the body. I mean, Tatra is known for its aerodynamic, streamlined look, so it's no wonder that they're able to integrate it so beautifully in this car.
Well, it's amazing to have this Tatra here. I'm so happy to be with you and a Tatra because it makes you smile, and I love that, Sam. And it also is a great example of the range of cars that you see in this air-cooled exhibition, because as we always try to do here at the Audrain, we try to bring you something that you know and love, like a Volkswagen Beetle, and something that you've probably never seen before, a Tatra 603. Thanks for joining us.